African football is more competitive than European football. And this past African Cup of Nations is proof of that. African football is more intense, more defensive, than European football. African football is definitely more intense and definitely more defensive than European football. African football is just a tougher game. It's a tougher game than European football. And a lot of people will argue with me, but it is what it is. And that's my opinion. To me, it's a fact. Sadio, a lot of the big African stars, who play in like the Premier League, players like Sadio Mane, Mohamed Salah. When the big African players, the star African players from the Premier League, when they come and play in the African competitions like that, AFCON, they struggle. When these African players who play at a very high level in the European leagues come and put on their African national jerseys on and play against other African teams, in the competitions like AFCON, these African players who have an easy time scoring a whole lot of goals in Europe, they have a hard time scoring goals, playing at the same high level, with the African squad. Why is that? And there's proof to this. Mohamed Salah, he's a goal machine for Mohamed Salah is a goal machine for, in the Premier League. One of the best players, if not the best player that they say. They say Mohamed Salah is the best player in the world right now. He's a goal machine in the Premier League, right? But in this past African Cup of Nations, he was struggling really bad. He was struggling. He couldn't score anything really in this African Cup of Nations. He probably scored one goal in this African Cup of Nations, Mohamed Salah, he went through like 10 games in the African Cup of Nations, only scored one goal, one normal goal. But when he plays in the Premier League, he's scoring like 2 goals every game. That's because African soccer is more competitive, it's more of a tougher game than European soccer. And that's for a couple of reasons. And I noticed this with a few players, even besides Mohamed Salah. The same thing with Sadio Mane. When Sadio Mane plays for his team in the Premier League, he plays at a very high level, right? He scores more regularly in the Premier. Sadio Mane scores more regularly in the Premier League than he does when he suits up for Senegal. And it's kind of like that with Wilfred Ndidi. Wilfred Ndidi, he's more of an effective player with this Premier League team. I think Wilfred Ndidi plays for Leicester City. Wilfred Ndidi is a better player for Leicester City than he is for Nigeria. And it's because African football is a tougher game than European football. It just is. It's more physical. It's more intense. They play in African football. They play real defense. Like the type of defense they play in African football is not like the European defense. It's not. They play in your face, physical defense. They're faster. Um, and the game in Africa is not as easy. And one of the things that make African football more difficult than European football is the pitch, the field pitch. In European football, in European stadiums, they have like a perfect field pitch. You know, when you play on that perfect field pitch that European teams play with, like for the Premier League and La Liga, their field is so perfect that it allows you to have a better first touch. When you play on that perfect pitch, it allows you to have a better first touch. Your players have an easier time having ball control and keeping control of the ball with that European pitch quality. It's easier to pass the ball accurately with that European pitch quality. And it just makes it an easier game. But when you switch to the African stadiums, the pitch, not all African stadiums have a horrible pitch, but the African pitch is not at the same high quality of the European football fields. It just isn't. When you watch African football, you notice that it's different, and that's one of the main reasons behind that is because the pitch, the stadium pitch, the field. When you watch African football, you see the ball is always bouncing up and down on the field. In African football, you never see the soccer ball just stay on the ground. It's always bouncing up and down, and that bouncing on that African style of turf makes it harder to pass the ball accurately and keep control of the ball, and it makes you have a harder time having a good first touch. So in African football, it's harder to pass the ball, harder to have good ball control. It's harder to dribble. African football is just harder. When you watch European football and then you watch African football, you can clearly see there's a style of play that's different. European football, it just visually looks a lot easier because it is easier, and one of the reasons is because that pitch, that European pitch, that high quality pitch that Europeans play on in their stadiums just makes football a whole lot easier, It just does. It's easier to pass the ball. It's easier to have a good first touch. It's easier to dribble, and it changes the game drastically. That's why when African players who play in the Premier League in Europe, such as Mohamed Salah, Sadio Mane, Wilfred Ndidi, when those African players come to Africa and play on the African pitch, they have so much of a harder time playing. It is what it is. And African football is just, besides the pitch, African football is just improving. Every few years, every 3 years, African football just gets better and better and better. European football is not improving. European football is just really staying the same. But African football is always getting better and better and better. You know, we should ask ourselves, like, has African football surpassed European football? I don't know. You know, maybe it has, because whenever these African superstars like a Sadio Mane, Mohamed Salah, they play at a very high level in Europe, but when they come and play for the African nations, they struggle. They don't play as well. Mohamed Salah, arguably, they say, is the best player in the world, but when he came and played against, African nations in the African Cup of Nations, Mohamed Salah, the quote unquote best player in the world, wasn't doing shit. He was struggling. Mohamed Salah, who's supposed to be the best player in the world, he was struggling against a small African country called Guinea-Bissau. That shows you, like, these African teams are improving. African teams are improving. If Mohamed Salah, the best player in the world, so-called, would struggle against Guinea-Bissau and these other African nations, imagine if Lionel Messi was playing against these other African teams. If Lionel Messi, Ronaldo played in the African Cup of Nations, they would struggle as well. If Sadio Mane and Mohamed Salah, if they can struggle playing against African teams, then Lionel Messi, Cristiano Ronaldo, they will struggle too. That's because African soccer, African football has improved to that level. Like you see countries, small African countries who historically aren't supposed to be so great, like a Gabon. You seen Gabon play neck and neck and drew with a very technical and technical team like Morocco. You would never see that a few years ago. A country like Gabon playing neck and neck and drawing with a very technical, a tactical team like a Morocco. Then you also seen another small African country. You seen Malawi, score a very nice goal against Morocco. Malawi was up 1-0 against Morocco, I believe, but Morocco ended up coming back. You'll never would have thought a small African country like Malawi will put up the first score against a very technical and tactical team like a Morocco. You'll never would think that. And that's because African football is improving. Yeah, Malawi, a small African country, like you'll never think Malawi is a football, soccer powerhouse in any means, but this same small Malawi held Sadio Mane, one of the best players in the world, a Premier League superstar. Sadio Mane was shut down scoreless against Malawi, a small African country. So you can't sleep on African teams. Like nowadays in African football, the small nations are almost just as good as the big nations in Africa. And I think, I think the future is bright for African football. Maybe an African nations can win the World Cup, because African football is always improving. European football, it has already hit its peak. European football is not improving. You know, South American football is not improving. It's already has hit its peak. But African football has gotten better. Maybe African football has eclipsed South American football. Maybe African football has eclipsed European football. I don't know. Um, yeah, like even a couple years ago, Nigeria played a friendly match against Brazil and drew 1-1. It was like back in the November of 2019. Nigeria played a friendly match against Brazil and drew 1-1. 20 years ago, Nigeria would never draw 1-1 against Brazil, which is I'm not saying Nigeria was a bad team 20 years ago, but 20 years ago, back in 2002, Brazil would have wiped out Nigeria probably like 3-0 or something. But in today's modern age of football, Nigeria can hold off a draw with a Brazil, and that's because African football is improving. African football is improving. And yes, African football is very competitive. Um, a lot of the games in this African Cup of Nations that just passed were very close. A lot of the games you saw in the African Cup of Nations were 1-1 draws, 0-0 draws, or very close matches. But in European football, you don't see countries in European competitions when a European nation plays against another European nation. You don't see those 1-1 draws, those 0-0 draws. You don't see close games like that, and when European nations play other European nations. But you see that in African football, and that's because in African football, nowadays especially, it's very defensive. African nations play close matches because African nations have improved on their defense. So you're never going to get an easy goal in African competition. But in European competition, you'll see Spain blow out a small European nation like 6-0. You'll see England blow out a small European nation 8-0. You won't see that in Africa because Africa, we play real defense. And our defense has improved to a level that we're now compact in the back like how European nations are compact. African football has improved in defense, in attack, and in technical and tactically also. So African football has improved, and maybe we could see an African nation win this World Cup. Hopefully, man. But are you guys? Peace.